Hey guys, tonight we begin with the medieval peasant wedding, a celebration that somehow blended holy vows, livestock, drunk uncles, and the occasional fistfight into what can only be described as a deeply rustic fever dream. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There were no invitations, no gilded parchment, no wax seals, not even an angry raven dropping scrolls on rooftops. In the medieval village, weddings spread by one method only: gossip. It usually started with a whisper at the well. Did you hear? Thomas is marrying Beatrix. A day later, it reached the baker, who told the miller, who told the midwife, who told literally everyone she passed, whether they cared or not. By nightfall, even the sheep knew someone was getting married. The priest, notably, was always the last to find out. There was no such thing as being uninvited. If you were alive and within walking distance, you went. Not because you were particularly close to the couple, but because weddings meant food, and drink, and maybe a fistfight if things got festive. The bride and groom didn't draw up guest lists. They had no control over who came. You could end up with 10 people or half the county. That's just how it worked. More people meant more gifts, which in peasant economics translated to possibly getting an extra chicken or sack of turnips. Valuable stuff if you're living on gruel. Of course, you had to plan for guests showing up, but you also had to plan for guests not showing up. Some might be dead, some might be drunk, some might just forget. One guy was still harvesting barley and didn't notice the entire wedding happened without him. Because let's be clear, time was flexible. Noon could mean anywhere between breakfast and sunset. There were no watches, just the sun and people's vague ability to guess how far it had moved since they last looked up from milking a cow. The bride and groom weren't fussed about seating charts or name cards. You sat wherever your behind landed, log, stone or haystack. And if the pig had already claimed your seat, well, too bad. The pig stays. In the medieval peasant world, formal wear was more of a suggestion than a standard. Fashion in this context wasn't about trends or elegance. It was about not being naked and maybe brushing the straw out of your hair. The bride did her best. She wore her nicest dress, which, to be fair, probably wasn't white. White fabric was impractical, expensive, and a magnet for every farm animal within a 2-mile radius. Instead, she wore brown, or grey, or off-grey, which had once been white before 3 harvests, and a sheep-related incident happened to it. She might weave a crown from wildflowers if it was spring, or ribbon from something vaguely decorative, like an old curtain or someone's spare belt. She didn't expect to look like a queen. She just hoped to look like someone who hadn't been digging onions all morning. The groom, meanwhile, tried to look respectable. He might wash his tunic. He might comb his hair, assuming he still had some. If he had shoes, they went on. If not, barefoot it was. Calloused feet were considered rustic, not rude. And if he smelled vaguely like pig, well, so did everyone. Hygiene was relative. Soap existed, but not the kind you'd want near your eyes. Bathing was done seasonally, or when it rained. So most guests didn't arrive sparkling clean. They arrived recognisably human. That was enough. Accessories were rare but meaningful. A belt with an extra pouch. Stylish. A hat with feathers. Bold. A tooth still in place. Luxury. No one owned jewellery unless it was stolen or passed down from a great-grandmother who had once kissed a merchant. Children arrived smeared in mud, proudly displaying whatever insect or twig they'd found on the way. Old men wore the same wool cloak they wore every day. Old women, wrapped in layers, cast judgmental glances at everyone, muttering, "When I got married," under their breath. But no one cared if your hem was frayed or your sleeves didn't match. This wasn't a fashion show. This was a rare break from labour, a communal moment of joy. And if you arrived with both your boots and your teeth, you were practically nobility. The wedding venue was wherever there was space and fewer than 5 pigs. Ideally, it was the churchyard. Not in the church, that was reserved for noble weddings and high-maintenance saints. Peasants made do with what they had, which often meant exchanging vows next to a grave, under a tree, or beside a chicken coop that doubled as a bandstand. Grass was a luxury. Most of the time, the ground was either dry and cracked, or soggy and full of surprise holes. If it had rained recently, and it usually had, the entire ceremony took place on a patch of churned-up mud, generously seasoned with manure. Guests arrived wearing their wedding boots, which were just their regular boots but with a resigned expression. There were no chairs, no bunting, no altar made from reclaimed oak. People stood, or squatted, or leaned against fences that creaked ominously. Sometimes someone brought a bench, and the elders claimed it immediately like royalty, without a throne. Everyone else just tried not to fall into a ditch. The decorations? Nature. Mostly weeds. If someone hung a few flowers or ribbons around a fence post, it was considered Martha Stewart-level ambition. The rest of the setting was filled in by animals, dogs sniffing everything, chickens absolutely underfoot, and the occasional confused goat photobombing the betrothal. And then there were the smells. Pigs in the next field. Sheep nearby. The faint but persistent scent of cabbage stew simmering in someone's pot. Combined with sweat and ale breath, it was less a wedding ambiance and more a medieval cologne sampler. But still, people showed up. Because setting didn't matter. This was a rare break from the grind of survival. The wedding could be held in a puddle surrounded by compost, and it would still be better than weeding barley all day. By the time the bride and groom stood before the priest, most of the guests were already itchy, sunburned, or 3 cups of ale into the celebration. Which was fine, because the ceremony itself wasn't exactly a Shakespearean affair. It was short. It was awkward. And if the priest had somewhere to be afterward, it was even shorter. For medieval peasants, marriage wasn't about flowers, rings, or tearful vows. It was mostly about contractual clarity. The church, by the 12th century, had begun to insist on a priest's involvement, but truth be told, many couples considered themselves married the moment they declared their consent in front of witnesses. I take you as mine, and you take me as yours. That was the gist. Romantic, in a highly practical, tax-liable way. Some ceremonies included a blessing and a few Latin mutterings. Most didn't involve kissing, not because of modesty, but because no one was eager to put their mouth on someone else's mouth after 6 days without soap. The priest might cross himself, say a prayer, and then rush off to his next task, like helping dig a grave or yelling at a goose. The church had range. There were no rings unless someone found a bent copper trinket or inherited a questionable family heirloom. Some couples exchanged small tokens, cloth, a knife, or a coin, to seal the deal. Others just shook hands and hoped no one backed out before sundown. Consent was the key. Both parties had to agree, out loud, and in front of others. If the bride said nothing and looked like she might bolt, the priest technically had to delay things. But often, a stern glance from a parent or a reminder of dowries already exchanged moved things along. Fast. And that was it. No organ music. No flower petals. No long speeches. Just 2 peasants, standing in a muddy yard, saying yes to a future of shared labour, screaming children, and, if they were lucky, 1 good blanket. But despite the simplicity, the weight was real. In that moment, surrounded by friends, livestock and curiosity-driven toddlers, they were bound. Not by lace or incense, but by words. And in the medieval world, words had power, especially when followed by ale. Now, when peasants said, "feast," what they meant was, "we have more than one kind of food today and nobody has to steal it." The post-wedding meal wasn't catered. There was no menu. There were no servers. There was, however, a communal pot that had been boiling for hours and contained roughly half the village's hopes and all of its root vegetables. The centerpiece of the meal was usually a stew, bubbling in a cauldron the size of a small cart. Into it went cabbage, leeks, onions, barley, turnips, maybe some dried peas, and, if you were really lucky, a bit of meat. A chicken, if someone had been feeling generous or reckless. Otherwise, flavour was left in the hands of salt or fate. Guests didn't sit at tables. They found a rock, a bench, or a sturdy dog. Bowls were passed around, and if you didn't bring one, you had to eat from your hands or borrow your neighbour's. Spoons were wooden, shared, or theoretical. Fingers did most of the work. Drinks were better. Ale was plentiful, home-brewed and stronger than expected. It went down fast, burned slightly, and made even burnt stew taste like joy. Water was technically an option, but most people avoided it, since it often doubled as a bacteria cocktail. Ale, safer and more festive. Bread, when available, was dense enough to stun a pig. It was either fresh and sour, or old and sharp enough to qualify as a weapon. Cheese made appearances too, but only if the cow had been kind that week. There were no desserts unless someone brought berries or dried fruit, and no one trusted the berries. Still, it was abundance by peasant standards. A second bowl? A third? That was luxury. Children raced around with crusts in hand. Elders gnawed contentedly, gums be damned. Dogs wandered underfoot, receiving more food than usual and less appreciation than they deserved. And despite the lack of silver platters or fancy cuts, the feast meant something. It was a chance to be full, to rest, to celebrate something other than surviving winter. Because when you live a life ruled by seasons, ploughs, and random plague outbreaks, any excuse to eat together and laugh loudly is a victory, even if it tastes mostly like boiled cabbage. Forget blenders and monogrammed towels. In a medieval peasant wedding, the gift registry was simple. Bring whatever you can carry, preferably alive or edible. Wedding gifts weren't about sentiment, they were about survival. Guests brought what they had: a couple of eggs, a chunk of hard cheese, a chicken tied by its feet, or in truly generous cases, a small sack of grain. These weren't presents so much as practical investments in the couple's new life together, because nothing says, "Congratulations on your lifelong binding contract," like half a dozen turnips. Occasionally someone would arrive with something a bit more interpretive. An old hoe missing a handle, a wooden spoon with bite marks, a goat with a limp and questionable eyesight. But even that was better than arriving empty-handed. Showing up without a gift marked you as either very poor or very bold, and either way, people noticed. Money was rare. Most peasants didn't see coins often, and when they did, they tended to hoard them like dragons hoard gold. So the idea of giving money as a wedding gift was laughable. Goods, not coins, made the world go round. If someone gave the bride a jug of ale or a loaf of fresh bread, they were practically royalty. Sometimes gifts were recycled, and yes, that's as medieval as it gets. A goose given at your wedding might reappear at your cousin's wedding a year later, slightly older and angrier. There were whispers of one clay jug making the rounds for over a decade. No one remembered where it came from. No one dared keep it. But the gifts weren't just for the couple. They also played a role in community optics. Giving something useful proved you were invested in the household's success. It signaled goodwill, participation, and maybe a hope that when it was your turn to marry, someone would return the favour with a particularly plump chicken. And despite the randomness and re-gifting, there was warmth in it. These weren't luxurious things, but they were what people could spare. In a world where most had little, giving anything at all was an act of generosity, even if it squawked the whole way there. Every medieval village had its own cast of characters, and they all showed up at weddings, uninvited and impossible to miss. Think of it as a social reunion mixed with reality TV, minus the cameras and with more goats. First, there was the village loudmouth, usually an older woman who knew everyone's business and had no filter. She'd start with, "Bless the happy couple," and finish with, "Though we all remember what happened last harvest behind the bakehouse." She wasn't trying to stir the pot. She was the pot. Then came the local wise woman, part healer, part witch, full-time source of rumours. She would bless the couple with a mysterious herb no one could identify and mutter something like, "May your cows always give milk, unless they don't." People nodded solemnly. No one wanted to make eye contact. You'd also spot the retired soldier who hadn't fought a battle in 30 years, but still wore part of his dented helmet and told the same story about a skirmish near France that probably didn't happen. He'd shout, "To the bride and groom!" and immediately fall over. And of course the drunk uncle. Every village had one. Red-nosed, overly affectionate, and prone to yelling, "Love is war," while trying to dance with someone's grandmother. He'd gift a bent spoon or a suspiciously light jug of ale. Still, it was tradition. But beyond the personalities, the real engine of the wedding was gossip. Weddings were ideal breeding grounds for juicy whispers. Who showed up late? Who looked too cosy with the shepherd? Who brought a gift that looked suspiciously like the one they got last year? Nothing escaped notice. If the bride's dress had a stain, someone had an entire theory. If the groom looked pale, someone declared he'd been hexed. The talk started during the ceremony and would ripple out for weeks, woven into bread lines, passed between milk buckets, and baked into the village's collective memory. And honestly, people lived for it. Life was hard. Gossip was free. If you've ever been to a wedding where no one hired a babysitter, now imagine that, but with more mud, fewer teeth, and absolutely zero supervision. That's a medieval peasant wedding. Children were everywhere, not politely sitting, not carefully nibbling bread. No. They were tearing through the gathering like feral squirrels on a sugar high, fueled by stolen crusts and pure chaos. And no one stopped them. Not because adults didn't care, but because they were busy, eating, drinking, avoiding eye contact with their in-laws. In the absence of structured play or toys, kids got creative. They raced sticks down puddles, threw mud balls at chickens, dared each other to touch the priest's donkey. They used turnips as projectiles and haystacks as crash mats. At least one child always ended up in the stew pot, not in it, thankfully, but close enough to raise questions. Toddlers toddled directly into the ceremony. Babies were strapped to hips or simply plopped onto the ground like satchels. A child would cry every 5 minutes, either because they tripped, were bitten by another child, or had their only snack stolen by a passing dog. No one panicked. This was normal. The bride and groom often ignored the madness. Occasionally, the bride would grab a toddler by the collar mid-vow and hand them off to someone with, "Here, yours now." The child, unfazed, would simply scurry off like a tiny medieval gremlin. Sometimes there was a group of older kids, self-declared supervisors, who lorded over the little ones with all the compassion of tiny landlords. "No, you can't sit there." "Yes, we're allowed to take your bread." Lord of the Flies meets dirt and bad hygiene. In truth, weddings were some of the only times children were allowed, even encouraged, to be completely wild. It was understood. Let them burn off steam, while the adults did the same. If they didn't come back covered in scratches, bruises, and someone else's breadcrumbs, were they even at a wedding? By the end of the day, most children were passed out in hay piles, sticky and exhausted. A few had acquired minor injuries, but no one was surprised either. In the grand tradition of medieval peasant weddings, music was less organised performance, and more whatever sound someone could coax out of an object. If you were lucky, a local with a fiddle showed up. If you were very lucky, he knew more than one tune. The most common musician was that one guy, every village had one, who claimed he could play something. A flute, a pipe, a badly tuned lute with 3 strings and 1 dream. Sometimes the instrument was improvised. A pot lid and a stick, 2 jugs, or just enthusiastic whistling through missing teeth. If no one brought an instrument, well, congratulations. You now had a choir of ale-soaked uncles belting the one wedding song they all kind of remembered. The lyrics were vague, slightly inappropriate, and repeated until someone passed out or forgot the words, whichever came first. Drums, when present, were anything that made noise when hit. Buckets, barrels. One time, a well-fed goose in a sack. Rhythmic stomping was also a favourite, particularly useful since it doubled as dancing and scared away rats. The repertoire? Narrow. Most songs fell into one of three categories. Love songs, where someone definitely dies at the end. Drinking songs, where everyone dies at the end. Historical ballads, where everyone dies and loses their sheep. No one really cared about skill. Volume mattered more than melody. If you were loud and enthusiastic, you were a musician. If you had rhythm, you were a professional. If you could clap in time and not fall over, you were a legend. Children often joined in, adding high-pitched screeches to the mix. Dogs barked along. Occasionally, a rooster would try to solo. It was chaos, and yet, somehow, it worked. The soundscape was clumsy, off-key, occasionally alarming, but it filled the air with joy, or at least with noise, and that was enough. For peasants who rarely heard music beyond a church bell or the sound of rain on a leaking roof, this was magic. Brief, messy magic. Once the music started, and by music we mean rhythmic banging and someone whistling off-key, it was only a matter of time before the dancing began. And by dancing, we don't mean elegant waltzes or courtly steps. We mean stomping, flailing, and vaguely coordinated hopping, performed with the unhinged energy of people who had spent the last 6 months bent over in a barley field. There were no formal dances in peasant villages, no rehearsed routines. What you had was instinctual celebration, deeply chaotic, but undeniably sincere. People formed circles, lines, or something between the two, and just moved. There might be clapping, slapping, shouting, and stomping, often at the same time, and rarely in rhythm. Feet pounded the earth with enough force to startle birds and churn up mud. Arms were thrown around shoulders. Backs were slapped, sometimes accidentally. The elderly clapped along from the sidelines, cheering on anyone who managed to stay upright longer than 3 songs. Some villagers attempted fancier steps, usually the ones who had visited larger towns or heard tales from a travelling dancer who once passed through 5 years ago. These brave souls would try a spin or a leap, only to land awkwardly and pretend they meant to sit down anyway. Shoes were optional. By the second dance, most people had either kicked them off, lost them, or discovered they were slowing them down. Bare feet slapping muddy earth became the percussion section. Occasionally, someone would fall. Everyone would cheer. Falling was part of the ritual. The bride and groom were expected to participate, of course. The crowd would chant, shout encouragement, and sometimes physically shove them into the middle of the circle. They danced while blushing, laughing, or silently begging for someone else to steal the spotlight. Children joined in too, inventing their own moves, which mostly involved spinning until they fell over. One particularly bold child often started a conga line. No one knew where they learned it. They just did. And while no one would call it graceful, the dancing was honest. It was joyful. It was peasants saying, "We're alive, we're fed, we're together, let's move." If music was optional and dancing was improvised, ale was absolutely mandatory. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without it, and not just a pint or two. We're talking jugs, barrels, buckets, and anything else that could hold a fermented liquid without leaking too fast. Water was considered suspicious, mostly because it tended to contain unpleasant things like frogs, filth, or dysentery. Ale, on the other hand, had been boiled during brewing, which made it safer and far more entertaining. It wasn't always strong, but it could be, depending on who brewed it and how little they valued subtlety. Most weddings featured a mix of weak ale, suitable for children and the elderly, and something stronger, which could drop a grown man in 3 cups flat. The latter was often stored in large wooden casks and ladled out like soup. You didn't ask what was in it. You just drank it and hoped you remembered the rest of the evening. Mugs were passed around freely. If you had your own, great. If not, you shared. No one worried about germs, mostly because the concept of germs hadn't been invented yet, and also because ale felt clean. That tingly burning sensation? That was the sanitizing effect, they said, or possibly blindness. With each round, the crowd got louder, looser, and a bit more chaotic. Polite laughter gave way to belly laughs. Stories became more exaggerated. People started complimenting the bride's smile or the groom's oddly shaped knees. Someone always started a drinking song, which turned into a shouting contest, which then turned into a nap under the table. There was always one person who shouldn't have had that last cup. The kind who began by singing and ended by vomiting behind a haystack. And yet no one judged. That was just part of the ritual. In a world of hard labour, harsh winters, and looming mortality, ale was more than just a beverage. It was social glue. It made people talk, laugh, confess, and occasionally fall into a trough. And at a wedding, it served one essential purpose: to turn a sacred union into a party no one would remember clearly, but everyone would remember fondly. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without a touch of chaos. Not necessarily planned chaos, but the kind that simmers under the surface until someone's elbow nudges the wrong jug, or someone else flirts with the wrong cousin. Let's start with the flirtations. Weddings were matchmaking gold mines. You had music, drink, food, technically, and a field full of eligible peasants who had spent the past several months covered in mud and despair. A wedding offered the rare chance to see someone without soot on their face. It was basically medieval speed dating. Glances were exchanged. Flowers were awkwardly offered. A few brave souls attempted poetry, which usually involved rhyming hay with May, and quickly losing their nerve. The dance floor was prime flirting territory, though most moves involved tripping into someone and pretending it was romantic. Of course, not all flirtations were welcome, and that's where the fights began. The most common triggers: someone danced too closely with someone else's intended. Someone spilled ale on a borrowed tunic. Someone insulted someone's goat. Again. The fights were rarely serious, mostly shoving, slurred shouting, and the occasional wrestling match in the mud that no one actually tried to break up. By the time it ended, both parties were usually too tired or too drunk to remember what they were arguing about. They'd shake hands, share a mug, and move on. Then there were the accidents. Weddings, plus livestock, plus ale, equals unpredictable results. Chickens were frequently stepped on. Children fell into barrels. Someone always tripped into the stew pot. Once, a goat got tangled in the bride's veil and dragged her 10 feet before anyone noticed. She was fine. The goat was applauded, but no one was surprised. Accidents were part of the fun. They gave the villagers stories to tell for years to come. Remember Thomas's wedding? When old Magda sat on the beehive? Instant legend. And while nobles had pristine banquets and rehearsed toasts, peasants had spilled ale, accidental kisses, and mild head injuries, and somehow that felt more genuine. At some point in every medieval peasant wedding, right after the fourth drinking song but before the goat stole the bread, someone would look around and ask the question, "Hey, where'd the bride and groom go?" Cue the knowing smirks, the raised eyebrows, the older aunties nudging each other and muttering things like, "Well, they didn't waste time." Because everyone knew exactly where the newlyweds were, or at least what they were doing. Consummation wasn't just tradition. It was legally important. In medieval Christian Europe, a marriage wasn't considered fully valid until it was, let's say, made official in the eyes of the Lord, and a sagging straw mattress. Technically, some weddings even had witnesses. A disturbing mix of custom and nosiness, though by the later Middle Ages, most villages wisely abandoned that part. The newlyweds usually slipped away to a barn, or a back room, or a hayloft someone had swept for the occasion. Privacy was relative. There were no locks, and curtains were a luxury. But the important thing was symbolic disappearance. The community understood. Let them vanish. Let them bond. Meanwhile, back at the feast, the party carried on. The absence of the couple didn't stop the dancing, or the ale, or the off-key singing. If anything, it gave people something to gossip about. How long do you think they'll be gone? Betty trips over his own boots. She looked like she knew what she was doing. Well, his mother said he's clumsy. When the couple eventually reappeared, flushed, rumpled, vaguely victorious, no one said anything out loud, but everyone looked. The groom got handshakes. The bride got proud nods and unsolicited advice from women who'd been married since the great turnip shortage of 1314. Some couples didn't return at all. They fell asleep in the hay or decided that right now was a good time to start that domestic bliss early. No one blamed them. After months of labour and years of waiting, they'd earned their brief escape from noise, mud, and neighbours who couldn't stop commenting. And while there were no honeymoons, that stolen hour of privacy was the closest thing they'd ever get. The morning after a medieval peasant wedding was less romantic sunrise and more hangover with livestock. Gone were the music, laughter, and frantic goat chasing. In their place, aching feet, empty jugs, and the slow communal realization that someone had definitely slept in a cabbage patch. Guests emerged from wherever they'd collapsed. Haystacks, under carts, inside sheds, or simply curled up next to the communal fire like large, snoring cats. Hair was matted. Tunics were muddy. One man was wearing someone else's cloak and didn't seem particularly eager to give it back. The feast table, if you could call it that, was now a war zone. Half-eaten loaves, spilled ale, an overturned stew pot, and the unmistakable presence of a chicken that had clearly been there all night. Someone found a single shoe in a tree. Someone else had acquired a dog. Children were already up, of course. Wide awake and sticky, dragging sticks and singing fragments of the wedding song with lyrics they'd invented. One toddler walked past proudly holding a goose egg, and no one knew where he got it. Or if the goose was okay, the bride and groom, likely still hiding. They'd resurface eventually, tousled, exhausted, and probably with straw in their hair, ready to begin a new life of shared chores, livestock maintenance, and mild existential dread. But on this morning, they were allowed to remain mythical figures. Those with stronger stomachs helped clean. Bread crusts were salvaged, mugs stacked, barrels rolled. Others simply sat on logs, holding their heads and muttering prayers for silence, strong tea, or time travel. The priest walked by with a suspiciously smug look. He hadn't partied. He remembered everything. And worse, he was ready to talk about it. Yet, despite the mess, no one complained. There was a quiet satisfaction in the aftermath. The wedding had happened. The couple was married. The village had come together, danced, eaten, bled a little, and survived. That was enough. When you picture a medieval wedding, it's tempting to imagine elegance, flower garlands, flowing gowns, sweet music wafting through the trees. And that might have happened somewhere. But for peasants, the real legacy of a wedding was much simpler. It was mud, laughter, bruised knees, boiled cabbage, and community. These weddings weren't about prestige. They weren't spectacles meant to impress. There were no photographers, no planners, no mood boards. What there was, and what mattered, was presence. The whole village came out, not just to witness the vows, but to participate in something rare: joy. Because medieval life for peasants wasn't just hard, it was relentless. Hunger, disease, taxes, bad weather, and the occasional armed noble crashing through your barley field. Joy was brief. Fun was suspect. But weddings were the exception, a communal pause in the chaos. A moment where dirt-stained hands held bread instead of tools, and voices sang instead of swearing at rocks. Even if the stew was bland, the ale ran out, or someone got kicked by a donkey, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the village gathered to say, "These two people now face the world together. Let's all shout and spill things in their honour." And so the legacy of the peasant wedding wasn't captured in stained glass or chronicled in illuminated manuscripts. It lived on in stories told over bread fires, in the song hummed during the next harvest, in the smile between a couple sharing stew months later, now with calloused hands and shared debt. It was in the mud-streaked joy, the goose-related injuries, the whispered gossip that somehow became legend. It was real, it was messy, and it belonged to the people. And if the world ended tomorrow, as it occasionally tried to do in the Middle Ages, the villagers would at least have this memory. A day when life felt lighter, when no one worked, and when two people said yes to each other while chickens clucked disapprovingly nearby. Before the wine was poured or the lyre was plucked, there were rules. Lots of them. Despite the chaos and laughter later in the night, the Greek symposium was not some mindless frat party. It was ritualized, exclusive, and, strangely, sacred. You didn't just show up and start drinking. No, that would have been barbaric. First you had to be invited. The host, known as the symposiarch, carefully curated the guest list. This was an all-male affair, freeborn men only. Slaves? They served. Women? Only courtesans or hetairai were allowed inside. Wives stayed home. The evening began with a meal, the deipnon, where everyone would eat reclining on couches, heads propped up on cushions like relaxed philosophers. This wasn't the symposium proper. This was the warm-up. No alcohol yet. That came after. Because once the food was cleared and the floor swept, the real event began. The wine was mixed with water in a large crater. To drink wine unmixed, as the Scythians did, was considered uncivilized. The symposiarch decided the ratio. Weak? You're here for conversation. Strong? You're here for chaos. It was a fine line. Too sober, and things stayed stiff. Too drunk, and Plato's dialogues turned into a Dionysian disaster. Now here's where it gets interesting. Every symposium had a purpose, usually philosophical, political, or poetic. But underlying all that was a sense of sacred leisure, what the Greeks called schola. This wasn't wasted time. It was where ideas were born, where young aristocrats sharpened their minds, played verbal games, composed impromptu poetry, and maybe, just maybe, fell in love. Before the debates started, libations were poured to Dionysus, the god of wine and divine madness. There was singing, sometimes by hired musicians, sometimes by the guests themselves. A flute girl might play. A courtesan might challenge a guest to a riddle. But everything was structured. The wine passed clockwise. Each round came with a toast. Drinking too fast was frowned upon. Getting sloppy was shameful. The ideal guest? Witty, graceful, and just drunk enough to tell the truth beautifully. In the end, the symposium was a performance, a place where men proved their intellect as much as their tolerance for wine. It was a dance between reason and indulgence, and if you broke the rules, you weren't just embarrassing yourself, you were insulting the very spirit of the gathering. The physical setting of a symposium was no accident. It was a stage for both mind and body to perform. The event typically took place in a specially designed room in the Greek household called the andron, reserved solely for men. It was a square space lined with couches, or clenae, each wide enough for a man to recline on his side while propped up on one elbow. The centre was left open, perfect for servants to pour wine, dancers to perform, or for the occasional impromptu game involving tossing wine lees at a target. Yes, they had drinking games too. Light came from flickering oil lamps, and the air was thick with the scent of burning incense, roasted meats, and the occasional perfume worn by courtesans. It was intimate, sensual, and designed to lower inhibitions without erasing the intellect. The couches were arranged in a circle, encouraging eye contact, verbal sparring, and shared laughter. This wasn't just architecture, it was psychology. Everyone had equal status here. No one sat at the head of a table. No one was above another. This spatial equality fostered philosophical democracy, an egalitarian moment in a deeply hierarchical world. The mood could shift dramatically depending on the host and the mix of guests. Some symposia were political strategy sessions disguised as drinking parties. Others devolved into singing contests and naked dancing. And some like the one described in Plato's Symposium, were lofty, abstract, and almost religious in tone. But they all began in the same place, with a shared space, a shared drink, and a shared sense that something important was about to happen. Even the decor mattered. Walls were often adorned with mythological paintings, Hercules feasting with the gods, Dionysus leading his drunken revellers, satyrs chasing nymphs. These were not just pretty images, they were reminders of the thin veil between civilization and ecstatic chaos. They whispered, "This is play, but it's sacred play." And let's not forget the wine itself. Served in decorated cups, kylikes, these often had erotic or comic scenes painted at the bottom, slowly revealed as the drinker emptied his cup. The moment of draining your drink came with a laugh, a blush, or a clever comment, depending on who was watching. At the heart of many symposia was a dynamic that still baffles and fascinates modern minds, the paiderastia relationship between an older man, the Erastes, and a younger male beloved, the Eromenos. This wasn't just tolerated, it was idealized. The older man was the teacher, the lover, the sponsor of intellect and refinement. The younger man, usually a teenage boy of aristocratic birth, was the student and the object of admiration. And the symposium was their theatre. This bond wasn't purely carnal, at least not in theory. It was supposed to be about virtue, discipline, and the passing down of knowledge and moral character. But that didn't stop the air in the symposium from becoming charged with erotic tension. The older men would use clever wordplay and recited poetry to woo the beautiful youths reclining beside them. Compliments were expected. Groping was frowned upon. The key was restraint. It proved control, dignity, and the seriousness of one's intent. The beloved, meanwhile, was expected to resist, at least publicly. His virtue lay in how well he could deflect advances with grace and wit. A boy who gave in too easily lost social value. A boy who refused everyone forever risked seeming cold or arrogant. The ideal Eromenos kept everyone guessing. He blushed, he deflected, he teased, and above all, he listened. He was expected to absorb not just affection, but wisdom. Now, not every guest engaged in these dynamics. Married men were supposed to behave. But let's be honest, many didn't. Courtesans and heterae were allowed to offer physical pleasure, but the boys were meant to offer something higher. Inspiration. They were the muses of the male elite. Their youth reminded older men of fleeting beauty, of time's cruel advance, of why philosophy mattered in the first place. Plato famously used a symposium to explore the nature of love itself, eros as a ladder, beginning with physical attraction and rising toward divine contemplation. But that lofty climb began, quite literally, on a couch beside a beautiful boy. The intimacy of the setting made it possible to speak of the soul without embarrassment, to admit longing without shame. Wine was not just a beverage at the symposium, it was the fuel, the compass, and the test. But the Greeks didn't drink the way we do today. To them, consuming wine unmixed with water was considered the mark of a savage. The ideal Greek drinker diluted his wine with at least 3 parts water. Why? Because wine was not meant to overwhelm, it was meant to loosen the tongue without dulling the mind. The central crater, a large mixing vessel, sat in the middle of the room like an altar. The symposiarch, often elected for the evening, decided the wine-to-water ratio. He wielded great power. A strong mix meant a wild night. A weak one signalled a night of poetry and discourse. It was a delicate balance. Too sober, and the evening dragged. Too drunk, and you might vomit on your neighbour's sandals and earn eternal shame. Each guest was given a cup, often beautifully painted, and the wine was ladled out in rounds. It flowed clockwise, with each man taking a sip before passing it on. But it wasn't just about drinking. It was about rhythm. Each round came with a toast, a song, a witty remark. Wine invited vulnerability, creativity, and occasionally, madness. The The Greeks believed Dionysus, god of wine, could inspire both divine insight and complete insanity, depending on how much you poured. And pour they did, but not without purpose. There was an art to pacing oneself. A truly respectable guest could drink several rounds, trade clever jabs, recite Homer, and still sit upright. Losing control? That was for barbarians. In fact, the symposium was partly a training ground, to show that a real man could enjoy pleasure and still govern himself. Self-control, even in intoxication, was a virtue. That said, not all guests adhered to the ideal. The drunk who danced naked, knocked over the lyre player, or mistook the serving boy for a satyr became the subject of ridicule for years. Stories of symposium disasters were passed around like cautionary tales. But on the flip side, the slightly tipsy philosopher who spoke beautifully on the nature of justice or love might be remembered for eternity. Not every moment at a symposium was philosophical pondering. When the wine flowed and minds loosened, the Greeks turned to games and music, deliberate, structured amusements that revealed a man's spirit, cleverness, and social finesse. A symposium wasn't just a place for intellectual showmanship, it was a playground for performance. One of the most popular games was kotabos, a bizarre and surprisingly elegant pastime. Guests would flick the dregs of their wine at a target, often a saucer balanced on a stand or floating in a bowl of water, trying to knock it over with a well-aimed splash. Success wasn't just about skill, it was symbolic. Men often called out the name of a lover while launching their wine, a cheeky blend of flirtation and athleticism. Hit the mark? The gods approved your passion? Miss? Well, maybe you weren't worthy of her, or him. Music was ever present. A hired flute girl, olatrice, might play haunting tunes to accompany a toast or dance between courses. Sometimes she danced herself, swirling in rhythm with the rising heat of the evening. But the guests didn't just listen. They performed. Reciting Homer, improvising erotic poetry, or singing drinking songs was not optional. It was expected. A man who couldn't carry a tune or deliver a clever verse was silently judged, even pitied. But the real performance was verbal. Witty banter, sympathetic conversation, was an art form. Verbal duels tested memory, wordplay, philosophical knowledge, and charm. Men would pose riddles, challenge each other to poetic improvisation, or tell biting jokes. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about finesse. The best conversationalist was quick, thoughtful, and slightly provocative. And then there were the riddles, sometimes philosophical, sometimes obscene. A well-timed riddle could silence a room or send it into raucous laughter. The most admired guests could deliver a dirty pun and a theory of justice in the same breath. And if the room was right, if the wine was balanced and the company sharp, the entire event took on a magical atmosphere, half performance, half revelation. The goal of it all wasn't just to impress, it was to connect, to build bonds, to let personality, intellect, and desire intertwine. In this playful chaos, reputations were made, or destroyed. Because in the Greek symposium, you weren't just judged by what you thought, but by how cleverly you could say it while half drunk and draped in a tunic. While Greek wives stayed behind closed doors, barred from the intellectual and sensual world of the symposium, another kind of woman moved freely through the flickering lamplight. Hetairai. These high-class courtesans were not mere entertainers or sex workers. They were educated, witty, and trained in music, conversation, and seduction. They weren't just present at the symposium, they were vital to it. A hetaira could recite poetry, sing alongside the lyre, debate philosophical ideas, and outflirt even the cleverest aristocrat. Unlike most Greek women, she was not confined to the household. She could own property, attend parties, and even accumulate wealth. Some became legendary, like Aspasia, the famed partner of Pericles, who was rumoured to have taught rhetoric to Athens' greatest minds. But make no mistake, their position was complex. They walked a thin line between celebrated and scorned. Revered for their intellect and charm, They were also objects of lust and satire. Still, in the wine-soaked world of the symposium, the hetaira was often the only woman who could speak freely and be heard. Their presence changed the dynamic. With them, the evening was no longer just a boys' club of philosophy and flirting. It became a charged, unpredictable dance of power and performance. A well-placed remark from a hetaira could deflate a man's ego or spark a debate that lasted all night. They were conversational warriors, trained to challenge, tease, and occasionally humiliate. Eroticism was always in the air, but it wasn't always consummated. The flirtation, the tension, that was the point. Some hetairai were lovers, others remained distant, using allure as leverage. They played by their own rules, often using their beauty and wit to climb socially or manipulate political alliances. For many men, these women represented a fantasy: female companionship without domestic duty, sensuality without obedience, intellect without inhibition. They were free in a way that Greek wives could never be, and that made them both intoxicating and dangerous. In a room designed for male pleasure, the hetairai were a reminder that true control was never fully in male hands. They could ruin a joke, redirect a debate, or inspire a poem that would be remembered for generations. In a culture obsessed with power and performance, they were masters of both. While the symposium had its fair share of games, flirtation, and poetic excess, its greatest legacy may be intellectual. Beneath the laughter and rising intoxication, something remarkable happened. Serious thought took root. These were not mere drinking parties. They were laboratories of the mind. Somewhere between the third cup of wine and the last riddle, the guests often launched into debates that would shape Western philosophy forever. The most famous example, of course, is Plato's Symposium, a fictionalized account of a real gathering where Socrates, Alcibiades, Aristophanes, and others explored the nature of love. But this wasn't an isolated event. Across Greece, especially in Athens, symposiums were known as places where ideas collided. Public issues, metaphysics, morality, and human desire were all on the menu. These debates weren't lectures, they were battles of logic, of wit, of emotional conviction. The setting mattered. Wine lowered defences, humour softened blows, and the intimate space gave permission for vulnerability. You could challenge a man's view on justice, his belief in the gods, or even his sexual preferences, and if you were clever enough, earn his respect. One of the central themes was eros, erotic love, not just in the carnal sense, but as a philosophical force. Socrates, through Plato, described love as a ladder. It starts with physical attraction, rises through appreciation of beauty, and culminates in the contemplation of the eternal form of beauty itself. That idea? It was born at a symposium, but other topics came up too. What is virtue? What makes a man wise? Can the soul be immortal? Is pleasure a good in itself, or merely a distraction? These were not academic questions. They were urgent, personal, and delivered in between sips of spiced wine. It's no coincidence that many of the great thinkers of Greece, Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, frequented symposia. These events were incubators of thought. They offered a rare combination: leisure, intellect, sensuality, and challenge. And unlike public forums, the symposium allowed for nuance. You could speak freely, revise your opinions mid-sentence, or offer an idea half-formed and see where it went. For all their intellectual ambition and poetic charm, symposia could, and often did, spiral into chaos. While philosophers dreamed of truth and beauty, reality had a habit of barging in, wine-soaked and staggering. The symposium's tightrope walk between order and indulgence didn't always end well, and when it failed spectacularly. Take Alcibiades, for example, the handsome, brilliant, and deeply scandalous Athenian statesman. He famously crashed the symposium in Plato's dialogue, already drunk, crowned with ivy like Dionysus himself. Instead of offering a sober reflection on love, he gave a wildly personal and sexually charged speech about Socrates. It was funny, emotional, and borderline inappropriate. The line between admiration and desire blurred, and what was meant to be a noble evening turned into an unfiltered outpouring of drunken obsession. But Alcibiades' antics weren't just awkward, they were prophetic. He would go on to betray Athens, flee to Sparta, switch sides again, and die in exile. His love of wine, performance, and recklessness mirrored the dark side of the symposium culture. Charm without restraint, brilliance without ethics. And he wasn't alone. Many political scandals had their roots in symposia. Gossip spread quickly. Who flirted too boldly? Who got too drunk? Who insulted a guest or blasphemed a god in the haze of wine? It was all noted, whispered, and weaponized. A misstep in a private symposium could ruin a public career. Symposia also became associated with decadence, especially in later periods. As Athens declined and Rome rose, the original balance of intellect and indulgence tilted dangerously toward pure hedonism. Wine was no longer watered down. Guests competed in gluttony instead of poetry. The flute girls outnumbered the philosophers. And what was once sacred play became cynical performance. Even the Spartans, famously austere, mocked Athenian symposia as soft, effeminate, and corrupt. To them, the very idea of reclining on couches, debating love while sipping diluted wine, seemed like a recipe for moral decay. And in some ways, it was. Yet the Greeks were aware of the risks. That's why moderation was so prized. A man who could keep his dignity while drunk, charm without seducing, and argue without humiliating was the true hero of the symposium. Long after the last crater was emptied and the last lyre note faded, the Greek symposium left behind something far more enduring than a hangover. A legacy of intellectual culture that still shapes how we think, talk, and connect today. What began as a structured drinking party became one of history's most unlikely engines of philosophy, art, and social development. The symposium offered a radical idea, especially for its time, that leisure wasn't merely idleness. It was sacred space. Schola, the Greek word for leisure, is the root of our word school. That's no accident. The symposium turned leisure into a crucible for learning. It proved that wisdom didn't have to come from temples or classrooms alone. It could emerge amid wine, laughter, flirtation, and flame-lit debate. Plato's Symposium is the most famous relic of this world, and its impact is hard to overstate. It gave us not just a model of structured philosophical dialogue, but enduring concepts like Platonic love, the ladder of Eros, and the idea that beauty and truth are intimately connected. The format of that work, men reclining, drinking, and riffing on a shared theme, would become the prototype for everything from university seminars to late-night salons. The Romans inherited the symposium and transformed it into the convivium, a more lavish, less philosophical affair, but the structure remained. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers reawakened the spirit of the symposium in their own salons, circles, and societies. And even today, we carry echoes of it. The dinner party that turns into a deep conversation at midnight, the book club that spends more time on existential questions than the actual book, the podcast where two minds drink, laugh, and dissect reality. Even the symposium's flaws have left their mark. The gender exclusivity, the hierarchies of beauty and age, the danger of excess, all remain relevant as cautionary tales in how communities are built and broken. But perhaps its greatest gift was the idea that pleasure and thinking need not be at odds. That beauty, desire, humour, and intellect could all share a single room. That truth could be seduced, not just reasoned. In the end, the Greek symposium wasn't just where philosophy met pleasure. It was where civilization discovered that the mind, the body, and the spirit all need a place to play. And in that sacred, wine-slicked space, the Western world learned how to talk. Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Thebes or Memphis. The heat radiates off the limestone, and the air smells of incense, lotus, and palm wine. But what grabs your attention isn't the temples or the towering obelisks. It's the people. Men and women alike, their faces adorned with thick black eyeliner that extends dramatically from the corners of their eyes. Their heads are crowned not with natural hair, but with ornate wigs, braided, curled, sometimes perfumed. It's striking, unmistakable, and absolutely everywhere. In ancient Egypt, personal appearance wasn't just a matter of vanity, it was a coded language. What you wore on your head and painted around your eyes told the world who you were, what you believed, and where you stood in society. Wigs and eyeliner weren't mere trends, they were statements of identity, spirituality, and hygiene. Eyeliner, made from a dark green pigment called malachite, or the more famous coal from galena, a black lead sulfide, was applied with careful precision. The look was bold, but not just for beauty. It was believed to protect the eyes from harsh sunlight, much like how athletes today use black grease. More importantly, it had deep spiritual and medicinal significance. The ancient Egyptians believed the pigment protected against evil spirits and infections, especially from the Nile's ever-present flies and bacteria. This wasn't superstition alone. Modern science has confirmed that lead-based coal may have had antimicrobial properties. So yes, your eyeliner could save your life. As for the wigs, they were more than fashionable headpieces. Hair was shaved regularly to maintain cleanliness and prevent lice. Wigs were worn daily by elites and on special occasions by commoners. The material varied: wool, plant fibre, or human hair, and so did the complexity. Some were simple plaits, others towering structures of curls, beads, and even gold ornaments. A well-made wig was expensive and a symbol of wealth, much like a tailored suit or luxury handbag today. Together, the wig and the eyeliner created a persona, controlled, composed, and sacred. To appear in public without them, especially in the upper classes, would be unthinkable. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about being civilized, clean, protected, and in harmony with the gods. To ancient Egyptians, kohl wasn't just makeup. It was protection, identity, and even a kind of prayer. Both men and women, rich and poor, lined their eyes with bold strokes of black, stretching the pigment out toward the temples in elegant, sweeping arcs. And they didn't do it because it looked cool, though it absolutely did. They did it because the eyes were sacred. The ancient word for eye makeup was mesdeme, and applying it was an almost ritual act. The most common formula was made from galena, a dark grey mineral ground into fine powder and mixed with oils or animal fat. Applied with a stick, it formed that iconic black eyeliner that defined Egyptian faces for centuries. But there was more to it than aesthetics. Galena was thought to repel illness and misfortune. It wasn't just paint, it was magic. Why the obsession with the eyes? Because in Egyptian mythology, the eye had power. The eye of Horus, one of the most enduring symbols of protection and royal authority, represented healing and wholeness. To line one's eyes with kohl was to invoke this protective symbol, to spiritually and physically shield oneself from harm, and protection was no small matter in the ancient world. The Nile, while the giver of life, also brought disease and pests, flies, dust, bacteria. These were everyday concerns. Kohl may have acted as an early form of sunscreen and an antimicrobial barrier. Archaeologists even found that the lead salts in kohl stimulated nitric oxide production in the skin, which helps the immune system. So, in a very real sense, it healed while it decorated. But the use of kohl wasn't the same for everyone. The wealthy had access to finely milled galena and decorative applicators made from ivory or polished wood. Poorer citizens might use simpler versions or crushed charcoal. But the impulse to adorn and protect the eyes transcended class. Even labourers could be found with lined eyes, their own form of everyday sacredness. Interestingly, the act of painting one's eyes was deeply sensual, and not just in the modern cosmetic sense. It was intimate. To prepare your eyes for the world meant preparing your soul. It was a connection to the divine, the hygienic, and the erotic, all traced along the lash line. In ancient Egypt, your hair, or more precisely your wig, told people everything they needed to know about you. who you were, how clean you were, how rich you were, how close to the gods you stood. Wigs weren't just vanity, they were status, practicality, and ritual, all woven into a single elegant headpiece. Let's start with the basics. Most Egyptians shaved their heads. The reasons were practical and cultural. In the sweltering Egyptian climate, real hair was hot, sweaty, and a magnet for lice. Shaving it off was cleaner, cooler, and far more comfortable. But walking around bald didn't exactly scream elegant. So, enter the wig. Wigs were usually worn by the elite, pharaohs, priests, and wealthy nobles, but even middle-class citizens had simpler versions. They were made from a variety of materials depending on your social standing. The richest Egyptians commissioned wigs made from human hair, sometimes mixed with plant fibres or sheep's wool to add volume and structure. These wigs could be styled with elaborate curls, tight braids, or layered plaits, often set with beeswax and perfumed cones of scented fat that slowly melted into the scalp as the day wore on. In a word, luxurious. The shapes and styles were also statements. A short, geometric bob might indicate a formal occasion, while long cascading locks with golden beads screamed royal power. High-ranking priests often wore specific styles associated with their temple duties, and children, even royal ones, were sometimes depicted with the famous side lock of youth, often shaved clean, except for one ornate braid. But wigs were more than just aesthetic armour. They were deeply symbolic. To cover one's head was to signify control, purity, and divine alignment. Priests shaved completely before entering temples, but would don wigs when performing outside rituals, highlighting the difference between spiritual sanctity and public presentation. Over time, wigs became heirlooms, passed down or buried with their owners. A fine wig might be placed carefully in a tomb, its strands still holding their form after thousands of years. Some mummies have even been found with wigs still in place, delicate braids and tight curls resting above a silent face, ready for the afterlife. If wigs were the crown, perfume cones were the halo. No look in ancient Egypt was complete without fragrance, literally worn on your head. These odd-looking blobs we see in Egyptian art, perched atop elaborately braided wigs. They weren't just artistic flourishes. They were perfume cones, solid mixtures of oils, fat and scent, meant to slowly melt and bathe the wearer in divine aroma. The cones were made from a base of animal fat or beeswax infused with myrrh, frankincense, lotus, or cinnamon. As the day went on and the desert sun beat down, the cones would soften, slowly releasing their scent. This wasn't just for personal pleasure, it was a statement. I am clean. I am sacred. I smell like the gods. Scent in Egypt wasn't a luxury, it was a moral good. Cleanliness was next to godliness, quite literally. The gods were believed to be fragrant, and temples burned incense daily to invite them in. To walk through a city smelling like lotus or frankincense wasn't just attractive, it was spiritually resonant. A perfumed person was a civilized person, a person in harmony with Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic balance and order. Perfume cones weren't just for special occasions either. While elite Egyptians wore them to banquets and ceremonies, the daily act of anointing the body with oils and fragrant balms was common practice among all classes. Labourers, after a day's work in the sun, would wash and oil themselves. It was part of being human, and part of being worthy. Wigs often had their own scent too. Some were stored with perfumed leaves or herbs braided directly into the strands. Others were refreshed with oils rubbed gently into the fibres. A wealthy Egyptian's hair didn't just look good, it smelled divine. And that smell signalled everything: status, piety, and erotic appeal. Interestingly, this attention to fragrance also had practical benefits. The melting cones acted as a moisturizer in Egypt's arid climate, protecting hair and scalp. They may have even repelled insects. Once again, beauty and function went hand in hand. One of the most striking features of ancient Egyptian beauty culture was its egalitarian approach to cosmetics. In a world where modern standards often assign makeup and grooming to women alone, ancient Egypt blurs the lines. Men wore eyeliner, women shaved their heads, everyone oiled their skin, perfumed their bodies, and wore wigs on special occasions. Beauty was not gendered, it was sacred, hygienic, and deeply social. A high-status Egyptian man might begin his day with a full-body wash, followed by anointing himself with scented oils. Then came the application of kohl. Yes, thick, black eyeliner, applied with a smooth hand to both upper and lower eyelids. The eyes were extended outward with that iconic line we still associate with pharaohs and gods. It wasn't vanity. It was identity. Women followed a similar ritual, though with even more complexity in hair and fragrance. The beauty standards for elite women were steep. Pale skin, elaborate wigs, painted lips using ochre or carmine, and wide, defined eyes. But here's the twist. These routines weren't about competing with other women or impressing men. They were about aligning oneself with the divine. After all, the gods themselves were depicted in full regalia, heavily adorned, beautified, radiant. Androgyny, in fact, played a powerful symbolic role in Egyptian iconography. The gods blurred gender roles constantly. Hathor, the goddess of beauty and fertility, was both motherly and erotic. Osiris, ruler of the underworld, was depicted with green skin, a fake beard, and makeup, hardly hyper-masculine. Even pharaohs like Akhenaten were portrayed with curiously genderless features. Soft bellies, almond eyes, wide hips. This cultural acceptance of beautification across genders created a society where appearance was not just tolerated, it was expected. A man who didn't line his eyes or keep himself perfumed could be seen as lazy, uncivilized, or even irreligious. Personal grooming wasn't an indulgence, it was a duty. Even servants and labourers partook in the ritual, though with simpler materials. They might use soot instead of galena, plant oils instead of expensive perfume, linen wigs rather than human hair. But the impulse was the same: to present oneself as whole, clean, and worthy of respect. In ancient Egypt, to be clean was to be close to the gods. Dirt wasn't just unpleasant, it was unholy. And personal hygiene was a form of spiritual discipline. That's why wigs, eyeliner, perfumes, and cosmetics weren't just accessories of wealth or vanity. They were physical proof of your class, your discipline, and your worthiness to participate in society. Let's start with the basics. Hair. Shaving the head and body was common among both men and women. Hair trapped sweat and lice, enemies in the desert climate. A clean-shaven scalp signified order, self-control, and spiritual cleanliness. That's why priests, who served in temples, were required to shave completely and bathe multiple times a day. Their ritual duties demanded not just piety, but visible purity. Wigs then became both a practical and symbolic solution, offering style while allowing one to remain ritually clean underneath. Bathing was a daily practice for anyone who could afford the time and water. The wealthier you were, the more elaborate your hygiene routine. Wealthy households had footed basins and servants who poured water scented with lotus or rose petals over your body. You'd scrub yourself with natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt that served as soap, and follow it up with a generous application of oil to keep the skin supple. Your fragrance, too, told others how much you were worth. A cheap oil made from castor or moringa might get you through the day, but frankincense, cinnamon, or lotus oils, those marked you as someone of distinction. To be clean and perfumed was to be respectable. To be unwashed or smelly wasn't just a personal failing, it was a social scandal. And what about your eyeliner? The quality of your kohl, how finely it was ground, what minerals it used, and how artistically it was applied, was another visible marker of class. Sloppy lines or cheap materials would betray you immediately. A nobleman's kohl case might be made of ivory or alabaster. A labourer's, carved roughly from clay or wood. Clothing, too, reinforced these hygiene signals. Light, white linen was preferred. clean, breathable, and symbolic of purity. Stains or unwashed fabric suggested laziness or low status. In ancient Egypt, beauty wasn't just for the living, it followed you into the afterlife. The same kohl, wigs, and perfumes that signalled cleanliness, class, and devotion in daily life were carefully included in tombs to accompany the dead. Death, to the Egyptians, was not the end. It was a transition, and you were expected to look your best when meeting the gods. Tomb paintings and grave goods reveal just how deeply beauty rituals were tied to funerary practices. Elite mummies were buried with jars of cosmetics, coal pots, wig boxes, mirrors, scented oils, and even combs and razors. In some cases, the deceased was depicted on the coffin itself, with elaborately painted eyes and perfectly styled hair, often wearing a ceremonial wig adorned with gold or lapis. The message was clear. The soul should arrive in the next world clean, composed, and divine. Priests who prepared the body performed rituals that included cosmetic application. They painted the eyes with black lines, re-anointed the skin with oils, and sometimes even fitted the deceased with a wig before wrapping the body in linen. The intention was twofold: preserve the body and elevate the spirit. Beauty here wasn't just ceremonial, it was transformational. The opening of the mouth ceremony, one of the most vital rites for the dead, symbolically restored the senses, sight, smell, speech, to the departed soul. The beautifully lined eyes of the deceased were not merely symbolic. They were meant to see again in the afterlife. The perfume cones and sacred oils helped the spirit smell the sweet air of paradise, and the polished mirrors ensured the dead could admire their own perfected form for eternity. Even gods of death and protection were depicted as beautiful. Anubis, the jackal-headed embalmer, appears with black-lined eyes and sleek, idealized features. Isis and Nephthys, protectors of the dead, were always shown with perfect hair and divine cosmetics, models for both the living and the dying. For Egyptians, to be well-groomed in death was to show respect to the gods and signal readiness for rebirth. To decay, to stink, to appear unkempt. These weren't just physical failings, they were spiritual ones. Beneath the elegance of ancient Egyptian beauty, rituals lay a world of practical tools, well-crafted, ritualized, and surprisingly sophisticated. If you were an elite Egyptian preparing for a banquet, temple service, or your own burial, you didn't just slap on kohl with your finger or run a comb through your hair blindly. You had a personal beauty kit, often as finely made and symbolically charged as any religious artifact. Let's start with mirrors. Made from polished copper or bronze, these handheld discs gleamed enough to reflect the face clearly, at least for those who could afford them. These mirrors often had ornate handles carved from wood, ivory, or faience, and shaped like gods, lotus stems, or protective deities. Gazing into one was not just about vanity, it was a reminder of order, symmetry, and divine harmony. Kohl applicators were another essential. These were not flimsy brushes but thin rods, sometimes carved from bone, ivory, or metal, designed to dip into stone or ceramic pots filled with powdered galena or malachite. The act of lining one's eyes with these tools was often meditative, precise, and done with great care. Some of these applicators were so treasured they were buried with their owners. Wig combs were flat, wide, and made from carved wood or ivory, designed to gently untangle the intricate braids and curls of elaborate wigs. Wealthier individuals had full grooming kits that included razors for shaving, tweezers for plucking stray hairs, and even scent jars designed to hold various fragrant balms. Some high-ranking women even had servants whose sole job was maintaining wigs and mixing personalized perfume blends. Cosmetic palettes, slabs of stone used to grind and mix pigments, were part of nearly every household. Even children's tombs sometimes contained small palettes, indicating how early beauty rituals began. The famous Nama palette, one of Egypt's earliest archaeological finds, shows cosmetic tools already present at the dawn of Egyptian civilization, blending politics, ritual, and aesthetics into one stone. These tools weren't hidden in drawers. They were proudly displayed, often decorated with animal motifs or inscribed with protective spells. They served as reminders that beauty wasn't separate from life. It was central to it. You weren't just painting your face. You were participating in a sacred art form, using tools blessed by centuries of tradition. Thousands of years have passed since the last pharaoh applied his kohl, or a noblewoman placed a perfumed cone atop her wig. Yet the visual language of ancient Egyptian beauty continues to ripple through history, echoing in everything from high fashion to modern makeup tutorials. What began as sacred ritual and social necessity along the banks of the Nile now lives on in catwalks, cosmetics, and cultural imagination. Start with eyeliner, the bold extended line from the corner of the eye, that unmistakable cat eye, straight out of Egypt. Cleopatra didn't invent the look, but she certainly perfected it. And her image, widely circulated in art and cinema, turned Egyptian eye makeup into a global symbol of allure, mystery, and power. Today's eyeliner trends, whether high fashion or everyday glam, still chase that same elongated, dramatic form born in the temples of Hathor and the tombs of queens. Wigs, too, have made their rounds. Ancient Egyptians treated them not as mere fashion, but as expressions of hygiene, status, and control. Today, they represent transformation, identity, and even empowerment, worn proudly by celebrities, cancer survivors, and cultural performers alike. In many ways, the modern wig still carries the same message. I choose how I present myself to the world, and let's not forget skincare. The Egyptians were early masters of moisturizing, exfoliating, and perfuming the body. They used oils, salts, and clays not just for function, but as expressions of spirituality and discipline. Today's multi-step skincare routines, their DNA can be traced straight back to the anointing jars of Thebes. Even in pop culture, ancient Egyptian beauty refuses to die. Films, music videos, fashion shows, and cosmetics branding continually mine the visual power of Nefertiti's cheekbones or Tutankhamun's dramatic mask. These weren't just royalty, they were icons. Their beauty standards, once grounded in sacred belief, have become shorthand for elegance and mystery. But what endures most is the idea that beauty is never just about looking good. For the Egyptians, it was health, holiness, identity, and social structure, all painted in black coal and sculpted in curled wigs. And in a world that still wrestles with image, self-expression, and ritual, their message remains timeless. Beauty is power. Beauty is protection. Beauty is purpose. And from the temples of Karnak to the vanities of today, that truth still lines our eyes. In the dying days of 1606, 3 small ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, slipped away from the foggy shores of England under the banner of the Virginia Company. A private joint stock enterprise, the Virginia Company wasn't launching this voyage for charity or for the Crown's glory. It was a business venture, driven by dreams of gold, silk, spices, and, above all, profit. What they got instead was mud, disease, starvation, and a tiny, fragile outpost that would become the seed of British America. The men aboard these ships were a curious blend. There were seasoned sailors and labourers, but also many gentlemen, men with swords and titles, but no farming experience. Most had no idea how to build a colony. Few had ever done hard manual labour in their lives. Their expectations were wildly out of step with the reality waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. After more than 4 months at sea, including a stop in the Canary Islands and a storm-battered journey through the Caribbean, the expedition finally arrived in what would later be called Virginia. On May 14th, 1607, the settlers selected a swampy, uninhabited peninsula along the James River to build their settlement. They named it Jamestown, in honour of King James III. From a defensive standpoint, the site seemed ideal. It was far inland enough to avoid detection by the Spanish Navy, and surrounded by water on 3 sides, offering protection from possible native attacks. But the location came with a cost. Brackish, undrinkable water, rampant mosquitoes, and poor soil. It was, in almost every practical sense, a death trap. Still, they unloaded their supplies and began constructing a wooden fort. The settlers had little idea what awaited them. Harsh summers, freezing winters, and a thin supply line stretched across the ocean. Within weeks, illness began to spread. The water made them sick. Food was scarce. Leadership was weak, arguments constant. And yet, in that miserable, mosquito-infested patch of land, they laid the first stones of what would eventually grow into an empire. The gamble was massive. The risk was astronomical. But the dream of empire, wealth and glory drove them forward, blind to the disaster that was already beginning to unfold. Jamestown had been founded. But survival? That was a whole other matter. From the moment the settlers set foot on Jamestown's soil, death began its slow, relentless march. The land was lush with promise, but the reality turned cruel. The water was brackish, too salty to drink safely and too polluted to support life. Crops failed to grow in the sandy, marshy soil, and the men, mostly unused to hard labor, were not prepared to farm, fish, or hunt effectively. Within weeks, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria began to spread. Food supplies ran low almost immediately. Their original stockpiles, brought across the Atlantic, were never meant to last through an entire year. The settlers had counted on regular resupply ships and perhaps some quick local harvesting. Neither materialized. Most of the colonists were gentlemen or craftsmen, not farmers. They lacked the knowledge to grow crops in a new climate, and too many refused manual labor altogether, considering it beneath their station. The summer of 1607 was punishingly hot. Disease ravaged the population. Insects were everywhere. Drinking water from the river only worsened their condition. As hunger grew more desperate, the settlers turned to increasingly grim measures. They boiled leather for broth. They scavenged for roots, acorns, and even snakes and rats. By the winter, known grimly as the starving time, the situation turned horrific. That winter, the colony was under siege, not by Native Americans, but by nature and their own hubris. With Captain John Smith injured and gone, and tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy worsening, trade came to a halt. The settlers were effectively trapped behind the wooden walls of their fort, surrounded by hostile forests and freezing temperatures. Eyewitnesses reported unthinkable acts. The colonists resorted to cannibalism, exhuming corpses and boiling human flesh to survive. George Percy, one of the colony's leaders, later wrote of how they were driven through insufferable hunger to eat those things which nature most abhorred. Of the roughly 500 colonists alive in the fall of 1609, only about 60 survived to see the spring. If Jamestown had a turning point in its early chaos, it came in the form of one man, Captain John Smith. Soldier, adventurer, and, as he loved to remind everyone, survivor of many battles, Smith was not a nobleman. He didn't wear a powdered wig or carry a fancy title. But what he lacked in social standing, he made up for in grit, audacity, and hard-earned experience. Exactly what the floundering colony needed. By the fall of 1608, with the death toll rising and morale near collapse, Smith took command. He didn't ask politely. He seized control. The gentlemen who had refused to work found themselves on the receiving end of his infamous policy. He that will not work shall not eat. It wasn't a metaphor. Smith enforced labour, dividing the settlers into work gangs for building, farming, and securing firewood. No one was exempt, not even the gentlemen. Starvation had no respect for social rank. Smith also recognized the necessity of building relationships with the surrounding Powhatan tribes. Where others had treated the natives with suspicion or hostility, Smith brought diplomacy backed by force. He traded copper pots and beads for corn and grain, using gifts, threats, and strategic shows of strength to secure food. These exchanges weren't always peaceful, but they often worked. In a time when famine haunted every meal, Smith's ability to secure supplies kept the colony from total collapse. He mapped the Chesapeake Bay with military precision, drawing the first accurate charts of the region. These would prove invaluable to future settlers. His exploration also revealed how little the English knew about the land they claimed. They weren't in a void. They were surrounded by powerful, organized native societies that vastly outnumbered them. Despite his success, Smith wasn't loved. He was abrasive, egotistical, and quick to insult his enemies, which in Jamestown was practically everyone. In 1609, a gunpowder explosion left him badly injured. Whether it was sabotage or an accident remains unclear, but the result was final. Smith was sent back to England. Without his leadership, Jamestown fell once more into disarray, but the foundation he laid, discipline, diplomacy, and survival, left its mark. Captain John Smith didn't build a utopia. He built a chance, and in the wilderness of Virginia, that was more than most could manage. Long before the English ever set sail, the land they arrived on was already governed. It was not empty wilderness, but the heart of a vast and powerful Native American empire, the Powhatan Confederacy. Led by Wahunsenacau, referred to by the English simply as Chief Powhatan, this alliance of over 30 tribes controlled the entire Chesapeake region. They had established villages, cultivated fields, trade networks, and a complex political system. The English were not pioneers, they were intruders. At first, Chief Powhatan saw an opportunity. The newcomers brought metal tools, beads, mirrors, and weapons, items the Powhatans valued. A limited relationship might prove useful, especially if the English remained small and dependent. Early on, food and trade were exchanged. Diplomacy, strained though it was, held, but it was always precarious. In this tense atmosphere, one figure emerged as a symbol of attempted peace: Pocahontas. As Chief Powhatan's daughter, likely around 10 or 11 years old at the time, she was not a princess in the European sense, but she was politically important. According to John Smith, she famously saved his life from execution in 1607, though modern scholars debate whether the story was exaggerated, misinterpreted, or invented altogether. Regardless, Pocahontas became a recurring figure in English accounts, often acting as a messenger or intermediary between the two cultures. But the truce couldn't last. As Jamestown grew, so did English demands for food, land, and dominance. The settlers raided villages when trade faltered. Powhatan warriors retaliated. Trust eroded quickly. The English viewed the land as something to possess, the Powhatan as something to live within. This difference in worldview made peaceful coexistence almost impossible. By 1609, the relationship broke down entirely. The Powhatan Confederacy began a campaign of siege warfare, cutting Jamestown off from food and water during the brutal, starving time. Any settlers found outside the fort were ambushed and killed. Inside, colonists starved or died of disease. It was a power struggle, and Powhatan was sending a message. This land was not up for grabs. The English, weakened but defiant, refused to abandon the colony. They believed God and empire were on their side. The Powhatan believed they were defending their home. The battle for Virginia wasn't just about land. It was about survival, sovereignty, and the refusal to bow. Few names from early American history are as romanticized or misunderstood as Pocahontas. For centuries, her story has been twisted into legend, a native princess saving a white Englishman, bridging two cultures with a single act of love. The truth is far more complex and far more tragic. Pocahontas, whose real name was Matoaka, was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, and likely no more than 11 or 12 when the English first arrived. Her interactions with the colonists began early, largely through her connection to John Smith. Whether or not she saved Smith's life, as he later claimed, she did become a symbol of communication between the Powhatan and Jamestown. She brought messages, helped arrange food exchanges, and occasionally appeared at the settlement, though not as some exotic curiosity, but as a political figure in her own right. As tensions grew and diplomacy collapsed, Pocahontas disappeared from the English record for several years. Then, in 1613, everything changed. During one of the many skirmishes between the colonists and native tribes, Pocahontas was captured by the English and held as a bargaining chip. Her captors demanded her father return English prisoners and stolen weapons. Chief Powhatan stalled. Pocahontas remained in captivity. During her imprisonment, Pocahontas converted to Christianity and was baptized as Rebecca. Some say she did so willingly. Others argue it was a coerced conversion. Either way, the transformation made her an ideal tool for colonial propaganda. She married John Rolfe, a tobacco planter, in 1614. Their union temporarily helped secure peace between the English and the Powhatan in what came to be known as the Peace of Pocahontas. But this was no fairy tale. Pocahontas never returned to live among her people. In 1616, she was taken to England as a living advertisement for the success of the Jamestown experiment. She was paraded before nobles and King James himself, dressed in English gowns, speaking their language, her identity overwritten by colonial ambition. In 1617, while preparing to return to Virginia, Pocahontas died suddenly, likely of illness. She was around 21. Her death ended any illusion that harmony between the English and Powhatan could be sustained. Pocahontas lived between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. To the English, she was a symbol of conquest and assimilation. To her people, perhaps, a tragic reminder of what was being lost. By 1610, Jamestown had survived starvation, disease, leadership collapses and warfare, but barely. The colony still lacked what the Virginia Company wanted most: profit. There was no gold, no silk, and no spices. Investors back in London were growing restless. Colonization was expensive, and Jamestown was starting to look like a costly failure. What the settlers needed was a cash crop, something the English market would crave. And they found it in a leafy, bitter plant: tobacco. Enter John Rolfe. A young widower and ambitious planter, Rolfe brought with him a strain of tobacco seeds from the Caribbean, specifically Nicotiana tabacum. Unlike the harsher native variety used by the Powhatan, this imported tobacco was smoother, milder, and far more addictive. English consumers couldn't get enough of it. By 1612, Rolfe had successfully cultivated his first crop. Within just a few years, tobacco transformed Jamestown from a starving outpost into a booming economic enterprise. The plant thrived in the warm, humid Virginia climate. Tobacco fields began to sprawl outward from the fortified town, turning once hostile land into agricultural gold. The English had found their reason to stay. But tobacco came with a price. The crop drained soil nutrients quickly, requiring ever more land to maintain yields. That meant encroaching on native territory, further inflaming tensions with the Powhatan. The push for profits clashed directly with indigenous survival. Labour was another issue. Tobacco was incredibly labour-intensive. At first, the English relied on indentured servants, poor Europeans who worked for several years in exchange for passage to the New World. But even this wasn't enough. Within a few decades, Jamestown would begin importing enslaved Africans to meet the demand, laying the groundwork for a brutal system of slavery that would shape American history for centuries. Still, tobacco gave the colony life. Exports soared. New settlers arrived. Land grants expanded. Jamestown was no longer just an imperial experiment. It was a functioning, profitable settlement. It wasn't the future the Virginia Company originally envisioned. They had dreamed of finding gold mines and building cities. What they got was a muddy patch of land and fields full of tobacco. But it worked. And for England, that was enough. Tobacco didn't just save Jamestown. It bound the future of the American colonies to the soil, to labour, and to a deadly kind of success. In August of 1619, a ship anchored near Point Comfort, not far from Jamestown. Aboard were around 20 African men and women, captured by Portuguese traders seized by English privateers, and now sold to the English colonists. Their arrival marked a moment both understated and monumental, the first recorded instance of Africans being brought to English North America. The ship, the White Lion, had captured its human cargo from a Portuguese slave ship en route to the Spanish colonies. Once in Virginia, the Africans were exchanged for food and supplies. Official records described them as 20 and odd Negroes, and their exact legal status remains debated by historians. Were they slaves in the full sense? Or were they treated like indentured servants, expected to earn freedom over time? The truth is complex and ominous. Early records show that some Africans, like Anthony and Isabella, did gain freedom and even owned property. But as tobacco profits grew and labour needs increased, the lines between indentured servitude and racial slavery began to harden. What began ambiguously would, within a few decades, evolve into a rigid system of race-based chattel slavery. At first, these Africans joined a colony already dependent on forced labour. The fields of tobacco needed more hands than the English could provide. Indentured European labourers were dying of disease or fleeing into the frontier. The colonial economy was hungry, and African labour, perceived as more durable and less costly in the long term, offered a solution. The 1619 arrival is often considered a foundational moment in American history, not just for Jamestown, but for the nation that would emerge centuries later. It marked the beginning of a racial caste system that would shape laws, economies, and identities for generations. Yet at the time, it likely passed without fanfare. There were no speeches, no records of outrage, no sense of historical turning point. Just another transaction in a colony built on survival and profit. But the legacy was profound. Those first Africans, stripped of homeland, family, and freedom, laid roots in Virginia soil. From their suffering and resilience would grow a long, painful chapter of American history. Jamestown wasn't just the birthplace of English America. It was the beginning of something darker too, the American system of racial slavery. By 1619, Jamestown was no longer just a ragged outpost clinging to life. It was an economic engine fueled by tobacco and powered by labour, both indentured and enslaved. Yet, profit alone couldn't bind a people together when the Virginia Company's distant managers in London ignored colonial needs. The settlers demanded a voice. What they got would shape representative government in English America. In July 1619, Governor George Yeardley convened the First General Assembly at Jamestown's church, calling together 22 elected burgesses from various settlements along the James River. It was an unprecedented experiment, colonists choosing their own legislators to enact laws, levy taxes, and address local concerns. Over 3 days, these burgesses passed ordinances on land distribution, trade with native tribes, and even penalties for drunkenness. A bitter irony in the colony where wine and tobacco flowed freely. This representative body wasn't perfect. Voting was limited to free male property holders, landowners, or those with a certain tobacco yield. Yet it established a principle. Political power derived from consent, not just royal decree. When new settlers objected to unfair taxes or arbitrary arrest, they appealed not to the company's distant directors, but to their elected burgesses. Jamestown residents now had a mechanism to protect their interests, if they could only keep it alive amid crises. Trouble arrived swiftly. English reinforcements failed to arrive in 1622, and the Powhatan Confederacy launched a coordinated attack that killed a quarter of the colony in a single morning. The General Assembly reconvened at Smith's Hundred, debating emergency measures for defence and welfare. They authorised militias, regulated trade licences, and organised food stores. The Assembly became not just a legislative body, but a lifeline. Yet the Virginia Company's mismanagement persisted. Reports of misused funds, high mortality, and intermittent supplies angered King James I. In 1624, he dissolved the company's charter and proclaimed Virginia a royal colony. Jamestown's governor was now appointed by the Crown, but the General Assembly remained intact, an enduring legacy of 1619. Through charter collapse, deadly attacks, and economic turmoil, Jamestown's self-government proved its worth. The colony had transformed from a private venture into a political community, forging institutions that would outlast its cradle of mud and mosquitoes. As tobacco fields expanded and new settlers arrived, the idea that ordinary colonists could elect representatives became woven into the DNA of English America, a seed planted at a battered church in Jamestown, ready to bear fruit in the centuries to come. By the mid-1620s, Jamestown had evolved far beyond a struggling outpost into something entirely new, the symbolic and practical heart of English America. Yet its survival had been brutal. Thousands of lives had been lost through starvation, warfare, disease, and exploitation. The settlement's resilience, however, set a pattern that would shape the future colonies, the United States itself, and the modern world. Jamestown established critical precedents, both good and troubling. Politically, it pioneered representative government in North America. The General Assembly, founded in 1619, gave settlers a direct voice in local laws and taxation, laying the groundwork for American democracy. It showed colonists they could govern themselves, not perfectly, but independently. When tensions eventually arose between colonies and the British Crown, it was this deeply rooted tradition of self-rule that would fuel the revolutionary spirit. Economically, Jamestown's tobacco success was equally influential, binding future American prosperity to agricultural exports. Tobacco cultivation sparked a plantation economy that demanded vast amounts of land and labour. This hunger for labour initially led to indentured servitude, but rapidly accelerated into the full-fledged system of racial slavery that would define the American South for centuries. Culturally, Jamestown left lasting imprints too. English traditions, laws, language, and religious practices spread from the muddy banks of the James River to settlements along the Atlantic coast and beyond. Yet it also fostered a culture of violence and racial division, embodied by conflicts with native peoples and the exploitation of enslaved Africans. These seeds, planted early, would bloom into generations of systemic inequality and struggle. The Powhatan people paid perhaps the heaviest price. Within decades, disease and conflict decimated their population, destroying an entire way of life. Jamestown's success, built on tobacco and self-government, was intertwined with this devastating loss, a contradiction at the core of American history. Today, Jamestown is remembered not as a simple triumph, but as a story of survival, courage, greed, oppression, and innovation. Its legacy lives in the democratic institutions born from its muddy streets, in the cultural exchange that reshaped global history, and in the deep wounds that still mark the nation's soul. Ultimately, Jamestown's true legacy is complexity itself, a tale not easily simplified into heroes or villains. Instead, it remains a raw, honest mirror reflecting what America would become. Ambitious, contradictory, inventive, and often painfully human.